Welcome everyone. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. This is our fifth webinar and conversation in this series of MEC 2020. هيدا خامس لقاء بهالسلسلة اللقاءات والمحادثات للشرق الأوسط بسنة 2020. I'm going to offer some information about translation into Arabic because our webinar will be, or our conversation will be held in English with translation into Arabic. We'll be using the interpretation feature of Zoom to offer live translation into Arabic. So please bear with me. I'm going to give some instructions in Arabic. هالندوة رح تكون باللغة الإنجليزية ورح نترجم للغة العربية. ورح تكون الترجمة فورية. بشكر مترجمنا نبيل الليلي. إذا كنت بحاجة لترجمة للغة العربية لازم تكبس على زر interpretation أو التفسير على زوم، على تطبيق زوم، وعلى خيار اللغة العربية. إذا ما في خيار اللغة العربية عندك يعني ما عندك آخر تنزيل لزوم. ما عندك غير حل إلا إنه تطفي زوم، تحمل آخر نسخة وترجع تفوت معنا على اللقاء. ما تنسوا تسكتوا كمان اللغة الإنجليزية بالضغط على mute the original audio لما بتنقلوا للغة العربية. I'm back with English language, so I'd like to welcome everyone again. We have currently about 75 participants from all around the world, and it's a pleasure and privilege to be able to host this important conversation tonight. The title of our conversation is Lebanon's Year of Meltdown, Faith Refined. In 2017, we held a consultation at ABTS, which was entitled The Church in Disorienting Times. Some of you out there may remember it, and others can read the valuable contributions on the topic in the book that we later published under the same title, The Church in Disorienting Times. It was a process of reflection over the impact of the Arab Spring, which was fresh still at the time, in very turbulent times. All of this now seems quite far away. Since then, Lebanon has gone through such a dizzying time that we are not disoriented anymore. Now we are totally off the rails. We've experienced a real meltdown. For a Christian like me, who has never even considered leaving my country, Lebanon, because of a strong sense of calling, I ask myself for the first time, is there any point to all of this at all? I spent the most formative years of my life from ages 3 to 18 through 15 years of the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990. I have been active in interfaith dialogue and in peace building for the past 20 years. But for the first time, I ask myself, why do I stay? Why should I stay? Sometimes I feel like the battered spouse in this unhealthy, addictive, codependent, abusive relationship with my country. Should I stay because of some patriotic attachment to an earthly piece of real estate? Is there a theology for the church in extreme crisis time? Is there any hope beyond looking forward to the second coming of Christ? Is there anything more for us to do for this world, for this country? I wonder how many of you out there are feeling similarly with this global pandemic, with our friends in the US coming toward presidential elections. Depending on where your hopes are attached, how your elections turn out may push you toward euphoria or despair. The questions we want to ask today are, how is the church different? How should the questions that followers of Jesus ask be different from the questions of others? I suspect our questions need to focus around the theme of hope. What keeps us going in times of crisis? On one end, we may say, our job is to preach the gospel and to win as many as possible to Christ. We are not of this world. It doesn't matter how things turn out. The daily matters of the world and of politics don't concern us. We are citizens of heaven. We sail through life like ducks through a stream of water. I must say that in times of despair, this option can feel really attractive to me. Wouldn't it be wonderful not to care about all the chaos around me? On the other hand, we may be so committed to the cause of justice, so convinced that our role as followers of Jesus is to change the world, that our heart does not find rest. We do not know peace because we will not stop until we've made not only a spiritual difference, but also a social, economic, and political difference in this world. That's more the sort of person that I am. But these times are terrible. If you're one of those people, rest and peace will not come to you in these terrible times of trouble. One day God spoke to me. I don't often use that expression. He said to me, Martin, let your goal be to change the world in all of the dimensions of life, but let not your assessment of success be according to the measurements of the world. We must measure success not based on the results of our work, but based on whether we have acted according to the values of the kingdom of God. If you achieve success in transforming your world, but fighting corruption effectively, by beating back poverty, by championing the cause of human rights and justice successfully, but you do so through manipulation, political maneuvering, or even violence, then believe me, you have failed miserably. But if you seem to fail repeatedly in making any significant difference around you, politically, economically, socially, environmentally, despite the fact that you have remained faithful to high biblical principles and to the values of the kingdom of God, then believe me, hear the following words from God. Well done, you good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Today, we're going to hear analyses and have a conversation with three guests. My name is Martin Akkad. I am the Chief Academic Officer at the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary and the Director of our Institute of Middle East Studies that has been hosting these conversations. And today we're going to do things a little bit differently than the previous 4 webinars. Instead of listening to each of our guests or respondents for 15, 20 minutes on their own on the screen, we're going to invite all of our guests on screen together, and we're going to have a conversation. It's going to be an engaging give and take conversation. We're going to have 3 guests, all are experts in their fields, and each is a follower of Jesus as well, who seek to be faithful to their master. But before introducing them to you, we're going to take a couple of minutes to watch a brief video that summarizes the past year of crisis. It was made by Joe Costa. He is a good friend, a youth leader, and a student in our master's program, the MREL in Middle East North African Studies, which is managed by our Institute of Middle East Studies. So I would ask you now to take some time to watch She Be Feed for 2 minutes.
صار قاطع سنة على ثورة 17 تشرين. قبل الثورة بكم يوم كان في حرايق ضخمة بجبال لبنان. كانت مراسلة التلفزيون الجديد عم تنقل الحدث وبتصير تبكي هي وعم تسمع صرخات الناس العلقانين ببيوتهم وبتقول المشهد مبكي هنا. المشهد مبكي هنا. بعتقد جملة بتلخص شو صار فينا بلبنان السنة الماضية.
إنه ولادي يربوا ببلد كل لحظة معقول تكون عم تشكل خطر على حياتهم، هذا بعد ما حكينا عن المستقبل يعني. فأكيد المشهد مبكي هنا.
قصة جامعتي صار عبء كبير علي وعلى أهلي. المشهد مبكي هنا.
شغلي وقف وعم كمل تدفيش. المشهد مبكي هنا.
صار إلنا شهرين على انفجار بيروت والعدالة بعدها ضايعة. المشهد مبكي هنا.
قمع عسكري للمتظاهرين وناس خسرت عيونها وإيديها وإجريها. المشهد مبكي هنا.
عملة وطنية عم تخسر قيمتها كل أسبوع وأسعار عم تطلع بدون سقف. المشهد مبكي هنا.
الكورونا اجت والإصابات عم بتزيد والمستشفيات منا جاهزة للأسوأ. المشهد مبكي هنا.
وأخيراً انفجار بيروت، أكبر انفجار بتاريخ لبنان. مشهد مش بس مبكي، مشهد مرعب. شوارع وأحياء تدمرت، آلاف الجرحى، كلنا بكينا. المشهد مبكي جدا هنا. مش غلط نصير نفكر طيب شو بعد فينا نعمل؟ وأصلا وين الله وسط كل هالمصايب؟ بعتقد الجواب لكل هول هو بالسنة يلي مرقنا فيها. بعتقد فهمنا انه ولا نظام ولا حلم ولا شيء رح ينقذنا او حتى يعطينا ثبات وقيمة. بعتقد استوحبنا انه الحياة اكبر بكتير من انه اتبع هيدا او اتكل على شغل او مصاري او فكرة. والله بكل بساطة الله كان ريليت من خلال يسوع المسيح لوجعنا ويحس معنا، لانه يسوع توجع على هالارض وحس ببشاعتها. فالله منه بعيد، بالعكس بيعرف بشو عم تمرق، بده اياك تخليه يكون حدك لتكون حياتك الصعبة والمبهدلة إلى قيمة بالأخير. انت شو بدك؟
المشهد مبكي هنا. What we are seeing, what we have seen this year has truly been sad and has driven us to the edge of hopelessness. I want to invite my three panelists now, and I want to update you. We have about 83 participants now from joining us from all over the world. Our three guests, good evening to you, Eugene, Wissam, and Nadia, joining us from Lebanon as well as Switzerland. Eugene Sensenig is a political scientist and a public theologian. He is a Mennonite himself, but also an expert in Catholic social theory and theology. He is a professor of political science at Notre Dame University in Lebanon. Our second guest, Wissam al-Salibi, is a human rights activist and faith-based advocate. He is representative to the UN for the World Evangelical Alliance and is based in Geneva. Our third guest, Nadia Khouri, is a public and environmental health expert and the executive director of a local NGO called Tahaddi, Challenge. Tahaddi works with extreme poverty in Lebanon. Welcome to the three of you, and thank you for joining us and agreeing to be part of this panel. And what I'd like to do with the three of you today is to explore some biblical and theological concepts for framing the role of the church in times of crisis. I know that neither of you is maybe specifically, let's say, an expert theologian. At least I don't believe so, but you can correct me later if I'm wrong. But you are followers of Jesus, and you are experts in various fields that represent the multiple gifts of the church and its work and witness in the world. I'm going to start by asking the three of you a basic question, which is, how would you describe the collapse of Lebanon in the past year from your various professional and personal personal perspectives. And that's the framing, the frame that I would like to start with. And I'd like to hear from each of you in turn. And I'm going to give you 5 to 7 minutes to present each from your perspective. We'll start with Eugene. We'll then move to Wissam, and then we will move to Nadia. And feel free to share your PowerPoint, those of you who would like to do so. And this year in Lebanon, we're dealing with, as we've seen, a political, an economic, and a health crisis, as well as the devastating outcomes of a massive blast on the 4th of August. All are set in an atmosphere of revolution and popular uprising that began on the 17th of October last year. There is a sense of despair, but also perhaps a wind of change. What is your analysis of the current situation in Lebanon from your various expert perspectives? Eugene, talk to us from your perspective as a political scientist.
So thank you. I'll start with my screen share, which is here. Can you see it? Can you see the screen? The screen
Yes.
share? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Brent, for inviting me. And as you said, you asked me to speak on the current situation in Lebanon from my expert position and perspective. And I'm a political scientist, but I'm also a believer and an activist. And I would say when we deal with the role of people of faith in the Thawra, or in the uprising, the popular rebellion, we need the tools of social science to do this. But when we deal with the role of our faith in the Thawra, in the rebellion, we need the tools of religion. And finally, we need to talk about, as you mentioned, our inner convictions, our purity of motives, and ultimately to ask, are we just as bad as everybody else? Do we ultimately stink as well? To study Christian activism, we need faith and science. And I want to point out that there's no contradiction. There's no incompatibility with the two. And there's a lot of discussion about faith and social sciences and science in general. To understand God's will in the world, we need faith, we need religion. But to look at the role of God's people in the world, we need the tools of social science. And ultimately, when to look at ourselves, look into ourselves and find out whether we stink or not, or whether we're as bad as the sulta, the power elites in politics and business, etc. We need to find out whether our motives are poor. The term is self-purification, and I'll get back to the origins of that term, self-purification, in a second. The whole dichotomy, the juxtaposition of science and faith, of socialism and social change from a Christian perspective starts in 1848 with Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And the response from the church in 1891, famously Rerum Novarum, the social encyclical from Pope Leo XIII, picks up on this and establishes the tradition of Catholic social teaching. Protestants and Orthodox follow suit in a somewhat less focused manner even today. For me personally, I've been here in Lebanon for 21 years, and I've been working with colleagues in Europe and in the Middle East on the weaknesses of Christian social thinking in the Middle East and North Africa. And why do I say weaknesses? Because when we compare our region to other areas of the global South with a strong Christian presence, like India, like Africa, the Philippines, or obviously South America, things look a lot different. We work at NDU with the Pope Benedict Chair. We also work with the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy at Catholic University in DC. Metanexus, which is a organization which specifically works on the dialogue between religion and science at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, my hometown. But also as an activist. I've been very active working as a deacon, as a member of the Council of Elders at the International Community Church under the leadership of Pastor Robert Hump, who then later on did his PhD on this topic. He worked together with us at NDU and did an empirical study of faith leaders, Christian leaders of all three denominations, all three branches, and found out that out of 50 leaders, only one of them actually saw a link between the personal faith, the gospel, and social justice. I asked him, Robert, tell me it wasn't a Protestant because that would make us look good. He said, it wasn't one of us. It was actually one of the other two branches. It's that bad. The three branches of Christianity in Lebanon are showing a lot of resistance to social justice dialogue and social justice activism. That's not a bad thing, ultimately. At the moment, most of them are just doing lip service, but some of them are going on the counterattack. And when they're responding to us in that they're actually attacking people within the church for speaking truth to power, that shows that things are moving in the right direction. At the moment, if you look at South America, you look at India, Africa, the Philippines, there are two major groups, organized labor and organized religion, which are pushing for social change. In the Middle East and in Lebanon in particular, they're both asleep at the wheel. Let's look now briefly at the three of the thinkers I wanted to pick up on, because you asked me to say who's important for me. One of them is Karl Marx, who famously said that philosophers are not only supposed to, philosophers, he means scientists in general, not just to study the world, but to change the world. And that's something we should also be doing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Martin? Good, okay.
Yes.
One of my favorite Catholics is an archbishop from Brazil by the name of Helder Camara. And this quote is, I think, most people know, when we within the church try to help the poor, they call us saints. When we ask why they're poor, they call us communists. Why is it when people in the church become active against or dealing with the root causes of social injustice, they put us in the camp of communism? Finally, one of the most practical of the leaders that I would like to mention is Martin Luther King, who, when in jail, wrote a letter to his fellow Christians with four not too easy steps to direct action. And the first one, as I said at the very beginning, is research. You go out and study the causes of social injustice, and then you negotiate in good faith. Thirdly, self-purification, and this is where I got the term from him, that we have to cleanse ourselves to make sure that we don't stink like everybody else, at least not intentionally. And then direct action, and if need be, go out and burn tires if that's your game. I want to also talk about the resilience in Lebanon. That's everyone's talking about. Lebanese can always get up and sort of muddle through and weasel their way out. And my family is originally from Austria, and at the end of the monarchy, at the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there's a famous saying, the situation is hopeless, but not serious. And that's something that we hear a lot along similar lines in Lebanon. The situation is hopeless, but somehow we're going to weasel our way out again this time. In Austria, when they did that, the empire collapsed and they had decades of fascism. I would like us to stop trying to be resilient and really go for the root causes. Looking back, in conclusion, after 21 years, we're moving backward. Things are not getting better. But hope is counterintuitive. And as Mahatma Gandhi famously said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. They're fighting us now, which is a good sign. Liberation theology and Catholic social teaching is being countered now within the Catholic Church by massive far-right voices. The far right in the Protestant tradition, and I would also probably say in the Orthodox tradition, is supporting right-wing populism and nationalism, and perhaps even racism and fascism. And that means that the groups, the voices within the church globally have to be talking about social justice more vehemently. What does it mean actually to speak truth to power within the church? Are we speaking truth to power in the MENA region? Are we speaking truth to power as Christians, not just as activists? And what is our added value as Christians in Lebanon? I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. Charity is a wonderful thing, and we've been doing this since humanity has had civilization. When you give a man a fish, that's charity, and he'll eat for a day. Empowerment is also wonderful. Teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for the rest of his life. However, don't forget to teach him about the monopoly rights of the fishing industry. That's what I mean by speaking truth to power. And it's when the church speaks truth to power that we ultimately change things and change ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene, for this very helpful opening talk, where you have focused on the importance of the church's political engagement, making change around it, but the importance of speaking truth to power, being prophetic, and that's something that the church has often failed to do. And we're going to explore this evening a further theological framework for doing that sort of thing. I'd like to move now to our second brief intervention from Wissam Al-Salibi, who, as I said, is a human rights activist based in Geneva and representing the World Evangelical Alliance at the UN there. So Wissam, I ask you the same question. What is your analysis of the current situation in Lebanon and of the year that we have just gone through?
Thank you, Martin, and everyone for hosting me. I actually happen to have asked the same questions that Eugene asked. Eugene asked, are we just as bad as everybody else? And do we also stink like everybody else? And this was a question that was, as of 17 October 2019, this was on my mind. And as the revolution progressed, I remember back then that I was much more skeptical than most people that I knew during this initial phase. And then when I wrote about it and reflected about it in a blog post on the IMES blog in January, I also retained this skepticism about what's happening. And I will just try to flesh out, why I was skeptical, and I'm still skeptical about this. And as Christians, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that we need to put our feet in the shoes of the Lebanese other, and to understand the fears of the Lebanese communities and what shapes their politics and allegiances. And I feel that this effort still needs to be made. I was reading a recent report a few weeks ago published that many of the loyalists who went to demonstrate suddenly had to go back to their previous political position because they were alienated by the slogans, by some of what happened during the protests, during the demonstrations. Whether attack on political figures, whether culturally, the DJing and belly dancing that happened, it just hit with a different cultural mindset than some of the demonstrations. But it just showed that, for us, for Christians, we did not make the effort to put ourselves in the shoes of the Shiite loyalists, the Sunni loyalists, Christians who are from other regions in Lebanon, the Druze, and try to understand their needs, their fears, and how we could shape a discourse that is attractive to them, that they're ready for it. And that what 17 October proved is that they're ready for a discourse that is attractive for them. But I feel that we as Christians, we fail to do so. Jesus, Martin, I didn't see your message, sorry. When Jesus came, he came and walked. Our theology tells us that God became human, and in this sense, we have to make this effort and go to the other side of the divides. And I feel like social media and all of this and the slogans "Kullun yani kullun," it wasn't, in my sense, was not helpful in building the healthy momentum. And as Christians, we could have thought more about what does it mean to embrace the other, and how should that frame our slogans rather than just copy pasting what was being said during the demonstrations that were taking place. And unfortunately, the alienation that took place of these loyalists from all communities who came in and then who had to withdraw, and then things didn't get any better. But to do so, to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other, we also need to recognize and overcome our own fears and hurt. And you know, it's a personal reflection that, you know, as a Lebanese, also growing up in the Civil War, and like most Lebanese growing up in the Civil War, we know people who died, we know relatives who died, we know we've been victims of other communities, and then there's fear, always ongoing fear of what's happening, and we have this inside us, and we do this effort to overcome our own fears, to be able to reach out to the others in Lebanon, to understand them. And to do this, are we solidly anchored in the promises of the gospel? Are we solidly anchored in our heavenly citizenship to the point where our citizenship here, we are able to make it much more inclusive? And part of this effort to put our feet in the shoes of the other is to understand the security fears of every single community in Lebanon. You know, we talk about Hezbollah, but we don't talk about, you know, and we say Hezbollah has a wide popular base, but why? You know, when the Shiites organized in the 70s and 80s, what was before? How were they mistreated? How was the feudalism undermining the rights and the dignity of the Shiites? What are their fears about this? What are their fears in relation to Israel and the occupation that ended in 2000? Then what are the fears of the Christians? What are the fears of the Sunnis, of the Druze? And also, what are the fears of the many secular human rights activists that bear the brunt of the violence of the state sometimes? And in the video initially with Joe that was the video that we showed in the beginning of this conversation, you know, we saw that the state, the police, the army were beating up, attacking demonstrators. And these are people that some of them I know, and they're, you know, this is a part of the Lebanese society that are also afraid of a government that, and historically the Lebanese government has the ability to torture, to kill demonstrators. This is not, you know, uncommon in our history. So there's also fear from all of this. And how do we account for all of this and then try to think through a solution? A governance system that can account for all of these fears and this historic hurt. And it was brought up by Eugene, but we need to also account for the sinfulness of the demonstrators and to challenge them. And during the demonstration, a lot of demonstrators and a lot of videos circulated on what does the demonstration want. And just to give one example, you know, an election based on an electoral law that is without any sectarian affiliation. You know, that was one of the proposals by a friend of mine that circulated widely. And then back then I was telling people, but what does that really mean? I mean, are you accounting for the consequences of such a request to have an electoral law not on Qaid al-Ta'ifi, the sectarian registration affiliation, as a Lebanon, for the whole of Lebanon? What, I mean, are we thinking of something that could end in peace or could end in a civil war if we have such a law? And I felt that we didn't reflect enough. And again, we just took a lot of input without really reflecting and thinking through of how what we're saying will resonate in the ears of the others, people around us. And one more element is we need to account for the sinful foreign interference in Lebanon. There's so much at stake in Lebanon, and all the states around us, near and far, are intervening in ways that would go against what Lebanese might want or might consider to be their priorities. And to give one example, Nadim Houri, who is currently the head of the Arab Reform Initiative, was reflecting on thinking, time is over? Okay, I will finish with this idea. He was reflecting and thinking, saying, he said that our priority should be the reform of the state, and then dealing with Hezbollah comes later. Okay, but then there are others who are saying that, no, we have to deal with Hezbollah and nothing else happens if we don't deal with Hezbollah. But how do we relate to these two proposals? What do we believe would be the right approach to do? And, you know, again, based on having a vision of understanding and embracing the other Lebanese and then taking their fears into account. So I'll stop here, Martin. I have a few more thoughts that I can say later.
Thank you, Wissam. Yes, I'm sure we'll have opportunity as we engage more, as well as during the Q&A session, to add some things that you haven't yet mentioned yet that you would like to share. I'd like to remind our participants that you can send questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we are going to have at the end probably about 20 more minutes of Q&A that we can address to our guests. So please write questions, and we will be processing them and addressing them to our guests at the end. We want to move to our third contributor, to our third guest, Nadia. And as I mentioned also, Nadia is a health and environmental expert and the executive director of Tahaddi, a local NGO. She has been working in a neighborhood of extreme poverty for the past 12 years or so. And so Nadia, give us your perspective on this past year. How do you how do you analyze this situation, and how has it affected the people that you serve in that neighborhood?
Thank you very, very much for having me and inviting me to join you. I'll just share my screen. So I will admit that when I first heard this question, I was at a bit of a loss for words, because as I reflected on the past year, and not only this year, but this period, I just felt we're in the midst of a very complex, multifaceted storm. And I was reminded by this painting by Jackson Pollock, who was an American painter, with all the dimensions, the dark, the light, and all these factors coming together to create the situation that I think we're facing now, or an image of the situation we're facing now. I just wanted to take a moment to unpack the crises, or the key points that I see in the crises, before taking maybe more of a micro level perspective to what we're facing. When I think of the crisis in Lebanon, I can't stop and think of only this year without first reflecting on the major crisis, the refugee crisis that Lebanon has also been facing since 2011. We have one of the highest per capita refugees in the world. 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people in Lebanon are refugees. And so all that we're experiencing this year is against the backdrop of a number of other social factors, which I think we also need to keep at the forefront of our mind. For me, the refugee crisis is especially a crisis for children, because we have a huge number of children that have been unable to access schools. I read a study recently that almost 1 million children, both Syrian and Lebanese, have limited access to education. And this is a crisis not for now only, but for the future. And in fact, I see it as an active impoverishment of the next generation. And I'd like to take a moment a bit later to speak about that. The next crisis, of course, is the economic crisis that was briefly mentioned in the video. But if we can just speak about that a little bit more, what does that actually mean? That means that we've lost between 60 to 80% of the value of our currency. That means you go to the supermarket one day and the price of butter is X, and the next day it's almost double. And so that's very, very heavy on people. And of course, we have Corona, which is a health crisis, but of course also an economic crisis. And combined with the latent economic crisis that Lebanon is facing, it's extreme for people. It's overwhelming. And there are specific sectors that are doubly hit. I would say the tourism sector, the construction sector, and the restaurant sector. And that's some of the people that are perhaps most on the margins of employment, as we'll see in a moment as well. And then, of course, we had the blast. For me, I wanted to show a big picture for the blast, a photograph in detail. This was the blast. This was a horrific, horrific event. There are no words to the amount of suffering, to the destruction of entire neighborhoods, to lives lost, and actually to the feeling that life is not precious. It is not cared for. It is deeply, deeply disturbing. And we have to attend to those emotions, the physical ailments that people continue to have, and the long-term economic and social destruction that it's bringing to our country. But what does this really mean for people? You know, when we think of all of these different crises happening at once, what does that mean in our own lives and the lives of those around us? Firstly, I would say everybody is affected, economically, emotionally, physically. Nobody is left untouched. And this is especially sensitive because in a way, many of us are used to being responders, but now we're also affected. And we have this tension to deal with. Secondly, as I mentioned, we have soaring unemployment. A recent study that was done, and it was done prior to the blast, said that 1 in 3 Lebanese are unemployed, and 2 out of 3 households have a reduction in their income. So even if they continue to be employed, the amount of the money that they're receiving at the household level has decreased. And bearing in mind, we're also having hyperinflation. And what we have now is almost 2 economies, the economy in Lebanese lira and the economy which is called in fresh dollars. And for me, I find this very worrying because those that are able to have their income in a foreign currency versus those in Lebanese, it risks, for example, widening the gap between the rich and the poor. We receive prices for most things in both currencies. And so you see these 2 economies rising in parallel. Maybe not rising, but separating, or the schism becoming wider between people of different income brackets or types of work. As I mentioned, certain types of workers were especially affected. Where I work, we mainly work with daily laborers. We've seen their work almost diminish. People working in construction, working, pushing carts, working in any type of work, cleaning, etc. And so there is no social protection for those types of workers. They don't have a contract, they can't work from home, etc. And also they usually tend to be among the poorest. They don't work, they don't eat. It's this kind of equation, they don't pay their rent, etc. As we mentioned, the prices of basic food has soared. You know, we see different statistics. Food is nearly tripled, but other commodities are much higher. There's also a lot of discussion, which is very stressful for people, about the removing of subsidies. I read also that if the decision is made to remove subsidies on bread, which is really the food of the poor, literally, the cost of bread will increase by up to 200%. I wanted to speak a bit about the crisis in education. So more than half of the refugees are out of school. 400,000 Lebanese children also struggling with access to school. Plus we had the blast, which damaged many schools around Beirut, over 130, some of them severely. And now, of course, we have the COVID crisis on top of that. The COVID crisis has been especially hard for poor families who cannot afford maybe school, the supplies needed, whether it's the device, the internet. This summer, we tried to develop an education program via WhatsApp. And so we distributed phones and we gave them subsidies for internet. But what we didn't anticipate was the electricity crisis that we then had this summer. And it became very, very difficult then to also address that. So as we come to the new academic year, we realize that there are many kids that are really going to have a hard time being in school. This is a picture I thought I'd share. This is the neighborhood in which we work. And this is the day where we opened registration for school. The crowds and crowds and crowds of people were standing at the entrance. This was very early in the morning, wanting to register their kids. Why is there an issue with education and access to education. There's physically not enough spaces in the schools to accommodate all the kids. And so every center is overwhelmed. So there are structural issues around education that must be addressed. I'll briefly speak about the health system, which is under considerable stress even before the COVID crisis. Our health system is very much based on a privatized approach. Most people, if they can, will choose private healthcare, and public institutions, which are very important for any public health system, are chronically underfunded. There's big efforts to create primary healthcare that's subsidized or at reasonable rates within community level, but again, it's chronically underfunded. And whatever type of medical care that people access, there's always a fee to pay. For the very poor, that's a terrifying prospect. They often avoid going to the emergency room, even if the initial fee is small, because they know that there's more fees to pay. Somebody, a doctor or a clinician, will ask them to do a lab exam that's very expensive, or they'll be asked to pay a copay to go to the hospital. So what happens is they often delay urgent care. In addition, because of the economic crisis, the cost of medication is rising. So how are people coping with all of these numerous things? How are the poor functioning? How are they getting through their day? We see an increased reliance on debt and more debt. And actually social networks, which are the usual avenues for debt, are exhausted. And so people are forced to take debts that are made more and more risky. And I have to say, in the past, there were some families that were taking out debt for food, but not as much as now. People are really are so cash insecure, if I might say, that they're even having to buy food on credit. I think this is an important indicator that we have to keep in mind. Also, we hear people expressing that they are hungry. To hear families saying again and again, "I'm hungry," is alarming. You know, we've been working in a very poor neighborhood for many years, but to hear people say "I'm hungry" is new to this year. Another thing that I'd like to highlight and speak out as much as I can is an increasing crisis involving child labor. And that's, to me, very much related to access to education. When children are not at home, are at home, not in school, they can be idle. To protect them, parents often think that they can at least teach them a trade. But then they become a source of cheaper labor and become more attractive to employers than adult labor, because it's cheaper. And with COVID, the children being at home has increased, child labor has increased. Economic crisis, of course, pushes parents to use this unfortunate coping mechanism for survival. We also see an increase in stress within the household, an increase in violence. Everybody's at home in a small house. There's not enough to go around, etc. I also say that people are foregoing necessary medical treatment. I heard a statistic that I found very alarming last week, that the case fatality rate for COVID is double among Palestinian refugees than to the national average. So if we absorb that, the number of Palestinians who with COVID and as a proportion is double that than Lebanese average. There's many, many factors that would go into that. Is it the quality of healthcare? Is it, are they presenting to the hospitals later? What is going on? Something is going on now that needs to be unraveled. These are two families that I know well. We've blurred the pictures on purpose. This is a family that relies on child labor on the left to survive. The entire family peels garlic all day. For each kilo of garlic that they peel, they get 500 lira. If the family peels all day, they can do 10 kilograms, which is 5,000, which is now less than $1. On the right is a boy that was working at a workshop. He cut his hand very badly. He was 10 years old and he's working for 10,000 a week, which I don't know, is $1.50 for a week of work. I just wanted to share a quote that I also heard recently from Dr. Firas Al-Abyad, who's our Dr. Fauci, if you will. He's leading the corona response here in Lebanon. He says, once a system is stressed, it shows its deficiencies. This is certainly the case for Lebanon. And so a lot of the social ills that were lying a bit maybe unfelt are now becoming much more apparent in Lebanon. But I would like to say that not only the strength, but also not only the weaknesses of the system, but also the strengths come out. When I think about how ABTS has responded to the crisis, opening their doors for medical workers to stay in the guest house, opening their doors for families who have been affected by the blast, I realized that the strength that we also exist in our society. Also, there are many creative initiatives to respond to the complex situation that we have. This is a photo I took today at the house of one of my colleagues and co-workers, who is part of a program that we developed to teach children in homes. We've trained mothers to teach children in their homes, just to address a bit some of this lack of space for children within the homes. So how do we think about all this biblically? I just want to leave you with this verse, which I found very touching. And as we think about this period and our natural desire to respond, there are many amazing initiatives being done by the church, especially in the education sector. I want to encourage us very much to continue because it's needed at this point. But let us keep our eye on the larger goal and the heart of God, which I think is for justice. So the Lord requires you but to do justice and to love kindness or mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And so, yes, we continue to do acts of service. It's important, but we must also look towards justice. And I think in our country, justice means systemic change in our social structures. It means working for education for everyone, healthcare for everyone, social safety nets, etc. And I think we're an important voice. The Christian community has been active in the social sector. We're an important voice. Let's use that voice to build strong structures that do justice and not just provide services, if you will, or are deeper than acts of charity. And in closing, I'm encouraged with this message. This is the message we have heard from him and declare to you, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And there is this beauty in thinking and being reminded that God's light shines on all of us. And even in the darkest times, his light is upon us. And we can access that, and his strength is near us and warms us and encourages us. So thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. And thank you again to Eugene and Wissam. And I'd like now to have a little bit of a conversation together with you before we move to Q&A. And I remind our participants that they can send questions to the Q&A through the Q&A feature in Zoom. And I'll ask our guests these questions maybe in about 10 minutes or so. So we've heard some very important things tonight. We have heard that the Christian life is more than a life within the church, that there is really a call to be active in society and even at a political level. We engage politics in society into the flow of how things are done around us, and we need to think, what are the values that direct and shape and foreign engagement. And that is about how this past year of crisis has affected people at the grassroots, people in day-to-day life, and particularly those struck by poverty. And I want to come to this particular question. The three of you, as I mentioned initially, are not only experts in your fields, but you also are men and women of faith. And have you seen any relevance to your personal faith in this year of crisis? I know I don't want simply to make this a redundant question, because you have framed the crisis within your own theology. How has your personal faith helped this dealing with perhaps we've sometimes felt during this year? Do you have a theological framework, maybe a biblical model, a biblical story, a parable, a favorite passage that has helped you make sense of all this faith? Can this help me, the church in Lebanon, to make better decisions as they relate to our faith? Would any of you like to this question? Eugene, you seem prepared to.
Yeah, well, I actually answered that question in my presentation. For me, the key passage from an archbishop in Brazil, from Helder Camara, is when we feed the poor, they call us saints. When we ask why they're poor, they call us communists. I think that was from his personal experience in the 70s. He was not part of the liberation theology movement, but he was a precursor of that movement. And it has had its ups and downs. It's coming back now with the current Pope Francis. And so I think that's, as a Mennonite, I'm not a big fan of liberation theology for theological reasons, but I really, really sympathize with that approach. And I think that's what we need to do here in Lebanon. On a deeply personal level, I was touched by what you said about leaving Lebanon. I mean, I too had decided I wasn't going to leave. They weren't going to chase me out, so to speak. And after 21 years, I thought, actually, can you hear me?
That's fine, actually. Thank you.
There's quite
Martin,
a bit
can
of
you hear
noise
me?
suddenly behind you, Eugene.
No, that's not me. There's no noise behind me. Maybe Nadia has to turn off her mic. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you, Eugene. Please carry on.
You said that you're thinking of leaving,
I said it the first time it came to mind.
Right, and that's a discussion. I mean, I feel like we all don't want to abandon not only the ship but the people who are on the ship. We have this sense of responsibility, and I've always thought that I can, because I used to teach in Austria before I came here, I can get a lot more. Not more mileage, but a lot more change in the students' hearts here than I ever could in Europe or in North America. So I'm struggling with this idea of leaving, but I think we're all, for various reasons, including our families, thinking of leaving, and that's a tough one. Thanks to COVID-19, the world has become even more global than it was before, as we can see with this webinar. But I would say that no matter where we are in the world, we have to look at the root causes. And as I said, also, do we stink? And this is the self-purification that Martin Luther King brings up. These are the two quotes, if you will, from Helder Camara and Martin Luther King that have been guiding lights for me. And I would say the self-purification more, because in civil society, we see a lot of unhappy, angry people because they are not, and I was this way for the longest time and probably still am, not dealing with the impure motives that we have fighting the good cause.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, I was interested to see that you questioned this. Well, you kind of turned around this "you stink" and you said "we stink," which I think is a very important statement. And Wissam also challenged this slogan, "you stink," or actually he challenged the "killon yani killon," which for those of you who don't know Arabic means all of you means all of you, or all of them means all of them. And so these slogans of the uprising, "you stink" and "all of you means all of you." I mean, what is the problem with this? What would be your slogan today in the current situation? The people of Lebanon have come into a state of despair where they know what they don't want, but they're not sure what they want. What would be your slogan for this revolution, Wissam?
So it would be "كلنا يعني كلنا." meaning us, all of us. No, it won't be that. You know, كلٌ يعني كلٌ, when you want to take down the system, everybody. It raises the question, and other slogans raise the question of what is justice? So, and Nadia concluded on this point saying, you know, we need a systemic change. We need to go deeper, not just charity, but something more just holistically. And Eugene said the same thing. And for me, the reasoning is, what is justice? So some of the justice that came out of the 17 October demonstrations was vengeful, was alienating, was self-righteous, and was not the justice that would transition us into a better society. That doesn't answer your question, though. I reflected on this. كلٌ يعني كلٌ is, in a way, it denies that the demonstrators could be worse or as sinful as those in power, as if those in power are bad and we are good. And this is not our theology, it's not our faith. This is not the justice that we are seeking. We want a justice that, you know, builds a future for everyone. And that requires a much more grassroots work to understand, again, what does every community need and how we can bring everyone together in security. I mean, some of the questions that I have related to this question, in addition to, you know, what Nadia mentioned, like how do we build a more just economy with social safety nets? I was thinking of several things in Lebanon, like practically speaking, there are over 100,000 public servants in Lebanon. And through this, the whole system of, you know, political parties, they just guarantee votes for you know, 100,000 will bring maybe, I don't know, 1 million votes in Lebanon. So there's a system that's very well entrenched. And what does a just solution? What does an exit strategy for these 100,000 public servants that are much in excess, or even, I mean, some people say 200,000, in excess of what we need? How do you exit them in a way, you know, reduce their number in a way that is dignified, is just for everyone? For these people.
Then you have all of these families that are in economic trouble, right? Because the bread earner has lost his job. So
true. So that's one layer to this questioning. But also, you would no longer have people who are in public service because of their political allegiances, and you would no longer have. You would, in a way, you know, is this a way to basically undermine the existing power structures that could lead to a better system of governance? Maybe not. I just wanted to raise this question, just to give a practical example of how the system is very solid in Lebanon, and how do you try to move? What questions you need to raise to move into a more just governance system?
Okay, so I'm sorry, but you've said that you don't like the slogan "all means all," and a few hours ago we've just recycled the prime minister that was ousted as a result of the October Revolution a year ago exactly. Today, he steps back into the role of prime minister appointee. And I'm not trying to take this into a political conversation, because I want to keep this, there are lots of conversations out there that are purely political. But what would you like the political system to become like? And that's one question that is asked by the audience. Do we want simply to adjust the sectarian system, or do we want to replace it completely? And how do we agree even what we want? Because everyone in Lebanon seems to want something different. Do you have thoughts on that real quick, Wissam?
I've thought about this, and one of the hindrances for me is to what extent Lebanon is connected to the region. And I would like to see a system in Lebanon that's there's rule of law and human rights and dignified living equal for all the citizens. Whether in some of the current format, or more radically different. But I admit I haven't done my homework yet into envisioning this system. But then when I try to think more about what solution can we have for Lebanon, I will, we face regional dilemmas that just prevent Lebanon from progressing. Everything from Iran and Hezbollah to Israel to Syria to the US to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and everyone. And I think more in terms of processes, in terms of how do we account for all of this into our vision of transitioning Lebanon into a more just society, into a more just system of governance. So I don't know have an answer yet to your question. I'm thinking more in terms of processes without really knowing what the final outcome will be. And it's just more thinking I'm putting into it, but I really don't know. I know the outcome in terms of human rights. I know the outcome in terms of the governing principles because I'm a human rights advocate. I do this for other countries. We advocate, but yeah, I'm still struggling into knowing how to move there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a difficult question. So thanks for your reflections. Nadia, I wonder whether you have any slogan for the revolution. What would you say? Don't forget to unmute your microphone before shouting it out.
That's a big question. I don't immediately have a slogan, but I think that we'll never have a stable country if we don't address the deep inequality on so many levels. I think that's critical to moving forward to a stable society. And so my slogan would really be about a dignified life for all. How we get there, as Wissam said, is a very complicated process, but I think that should be our end goal.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I think maybe that joins a little bit what Eugene has brought up with in the letter of Martin Luther King Jr. to the leaders of the church from prison, and this process of self-purification, right? And so he has turned back on himself, not only you stink, but we stink, we all stink. And you're saying we cannot simply, cry out slogans without looking inwardly as well and thinking about what's wrong. One person in the audience, John, asks, I am part of this corrupt society. I cannot ask God to bless us, to help us, before I ask him to forgive us. For instance, the way that we treat the foreign worker. Of course, you gave us many examples, Nadia, about how we also need forgiveness for the way maybe we treat refugees, displaced people. Few people even know that the neighborhood where you work actually exists. We just see those women and children who bother us at the street corners, and we're not quite sure what to do about it. It's too troublesome to even think about it. If I wanted to ask, what should be our response to this kind of thing? How do we go through this process of self-purification? I don't know, Eugene, you've done some thinking about this, and are there very practical ways that you would suggest this should be done in Lebanon? How do we look in the mirror before even wanting to change the system and the world around us?
Well, I think one of the assumptions is that we have too much religion in Lebanon. If we could have less religion, we would solve some of our problems. And in my opinion, we have not enough religion in the sense that the positive sides of religion related to, are you seeing me? Am I losing connection? Yeah, okay. The positive sides of religion are missing, which are the social justice agenda. The issue in some of the Q&As that came in is the issue of sectarianism. And I think this is an important, what Wissam was talking about, and also Nadia. Sectarianism is the abuse of religion for policy purposes. Whereas confessionalism, I think, is very, very important. We need to keep this in place. We need to have something similar to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, to the setups they have in Spain and in Italy and South Tyrol and in Catalonia, etc. This is normal. In the Netherlands, it's normal. In Switzerland, it's normal. It's the abuse that is the problem. So on the one hand, I think that we need to see confessions as part of our identity, and Christians and Druze and Armenians, etc., need this protection. On the other hand, to answer your question, I think that we need to really focus on the positive sides of our traditions in the last 150 years. And the work that I've been doing on the role of the Ottoman millet system, the way that the economic, political, and religious leaders are integrated goes back to the reforms in the millet system in the 1850s and 60s, and it leads up until today. And when the Ottomans wanted to get rid of the millet system, it was the Christian and Jewish leaders who wanted to keep it. And to this very day, this is what feeds into the system. And this is the abuse. This is the sectarian side of confessionalism. Confessionalism is merely a religious expression of what otherwise is social class, language group, what you see around the world. So I think that is, it's a two-pronged response. One is to augment religion with the positive sides. And the second is to realize that confessionalism is not a bad thing. It's not a dirty word. It's sectarianism, which is the dirty word.
Thank you. Very insightful to distinguish between sectarianism and denominationalism, or so one that is more an objective description of a reality, and the other which is the use of maybe it's the same difference as between saying a political party or political parties on the one hand, and partisanship, which is a more sort of extremism or supporting one group over another in sometimes not very thoughtful ways. And so Wissam, I'm sending you another question from the audience. Again, maybe I'm getting back to your response to the Killon Yani Killon and your
I'm
dislike.
looking at the questions now. Yeah, tell me more. Yeah.
Your dislike of that slogan. So how do we? Are you suggesting that we should, therefore, as a church, engage with the existing political elite in order to bring a just solution, or should we work towards change and replacement of this elite, or what are the other options between we want them all out and we are going to cozy up with the current elite, because that's what the church often does and has often done and often still does, including in Lebanon?
So there's the first element of your question is, what should the church work on or do? And I think the first element is, and this is my presentation, is the church needs to have a better understanding of how the Bible informs our public engagement. During the revolution, there were several answers. One of them, yes, let's go down. One of them, no, we respect the authorities in place. And there was a dialogue over Romans 13 and its implications. And none of these were geared to equipping the church in order to engage in its own slogans and understanding of a just society, so that they could bring in their own slogan and inform so if you want to speak with the elite or with the people, we need to not echo what exists, but just come in and have a different form of engagement that's building the trust Martin, I think you do this in the peace building initiatives at ABTS to a certain extent. Now, once we as a church have a better understanding of our role, our vision, and yes, we can engage with the elite, yes, we can engage at the lower echelons of society to understand more. We need to build the relationships that can affect change based on our values and our engagement, based on our vision for society, but also we need to gently call out when there's injustice. We need to, balance this, reaching out to the other, but also call out the injustice that can range from the army and the police shooting demonstrators to migrant domestic workers being mistreated to, just recently the inability of parliament to enshrine a law that prevents torture in prison by when someone is detained. So the Bible does call us to engage on these issues. It doesn't call us to define what's the electoral law should look like, because you might go to the elite and they will tell you, what electoral law do you want? And the Bible doesn't tell us how do you want it. But then there are other issues that the Bible does call us to, does ask us to do in support of the oppressed, the poor, the needy, identify these in our society. Nadia mentioned an important segment of these people. Another segment was mentioned initially in the video that was shown, and there are others. And include those in the dialogue with the elite, include those with dialogue with the elite. But then my first point was not about the elite. My first point as a church is to engage with, to understand the other Lebanese and reach out to the other Lebanese in society, understand their fears. And it's not about the elite dialogue. It's more to go down deeper in society and build relationships with, South Lebanon, deep in South Lebanon, or in the Palestinian camp, or in Beirut Blast, what's happening, as a church.
So, I mean, surely there must be a multi-layered work. It's not just one way of doing things, and people have different callings and gifts and will engage differently in a particular situation. I'd like to hear a little bit more from Eugene, maybe about this. I don't know whether this. How do we engage with the sulta, with the authority? Is there a substitute between being co-opted on the one end, or simply wanting to overthrow the existing authorities? Don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I mean, I always find this discussion about Romans 13 in Lebanon a little bit amusing, because Romans 13, when Paul was referring to the Sulta, the power elite, he was referring to Caesar Nero. The Christians were marginalized. Today, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, for that matter, formally, are the Sulta. They're part of the power elite. So it's not a question of whether the church should engage with the Sulta, with the power elite. It's part of the power elite. And I think here the big distinction that needs to be made, as I mentioned before, sectarianism versus confessionalism, is also the two types of secularism, which is the French model of complete separation of all things related to faith and the public sphere, and secularity, almana almaniya, we know the discussion, where the institutions of the state and the institutions of the church with a small c are separated. And this is absolutely necessary. And this is where we have to work as believers to say, we have to disengage our Muslim brothers have to disengage, but within the church, the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant power elites have to disengage ultimately out of this structure of oppression and exploitation, which is the Lebanese sectarian system. So I would say that this is what we need to be discussing, is how do we face a power elite within our own ranks? Our And as Protestants, because that's what, even though Mennonites are not Protestants officially, as Protestants, our power elite is equally bad. And I think that Robert Hampton, his book on this topic, showed that Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic Christian leaders don't care about social justice at all. He calls it scriptural illiteracy. They don't care. So I would say the struggle is first within our own religious institutions, and then to disengage out of this destructive relationship with the economic and political sultan.
Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, that's, I think, very important. In fact, one person in our audience says that I found that the way the church, mostly evangelical, copes is by disengagement, or at the most opting for a charitable posture, just sending aid. And that applies for the church in the West, but it applies also for the church here in Lebanon. It's easier to give my ushur, my tithe, on Sunday rather than to get engaged. And engagement, she says, in dealing with root causes is costly and needs long-term commitment. And so I'd like to maybe ask this question: how do we move the church to dirty their hands and get involved? That's the question of Chris. And I'll turn the question a little bit differently and say, has any of you been successful in moving the church to dirty their hands and getting involved? And how did you do that? And there was great silence. Nobody was successful.
I have a little bit of an advantage because I grew up in an intentional community in the south side of Chicago.
Well, tell us, maybe we'll learn something from it.
It's called Beirut Blast Fellowship. It was founded in the late 50s and it still exists today. And so I grew up as a child, and my earliest memory, I wrote an article on this, was that poverty not only has sights and sounds, it also has smells. When you're helping to refurbish old, rotten buildings, and I was 5 at the time, my parents took us there and said, kids, you're going to help rebuild these houses. This was part of the Anabaptist attempt to recover the message, because the Mennonites in Europe sided with the Nazis. In Germany and Eastern Europe, they sided with the Nazis. And this was a shock to the Anabaptists in Holland and in the US and Canada. So we had in the 50s, and I'm old enough to remember the 50s, a little 60s maybe. So the church does get involved. Jimmy Carter is another example. Now, if we want to talk about Koinonia in Americas, Georgia was an inter-race intentional community in the 40s. There are examples in Lebanon of intentional communities. So I think intentional communities are one way of doing it, where you live your faith. And one of the things that Beirut Blast Fellowship did is it was not just withdrawal, but they were working, the Beirut Blast Fellowship was in the south side of Chicago. It was fighting for housing justice. It was fighting against the war in the beginnings of the war, Korea, and then the war in Vietnam. So if you withdraw, it's the wrong thing. The lesson from Romans 13 is when the state does not deserve our obedience, we don't obey. And pacifism does not mean passive. The two words mean completely different things. Pacifism is active, and pacifism is in your face. Now, as far as Lebanon is concerned, I'll pass. I'm not really, after 21 years, I've failed.
Well,
can I just give a quick...
Maybe this can inspire some people in the audience. I need to begin wrapping up because we only have a couple minutes left. I want to
say just one more thing.
Maybe Wissam, you can sort of put this in with your final reflection. I want to wrap this up by going back to the question of despair and hopelessness, and the Bible is quite strong on the notion of hope, and a few questions from the audience have been about evaluation. How do we evaluate success? Because I brought this up in my introduction. And so I want to ask each of you to close by telling us, how do you know that you are doing what you feel you've been called to do? How do you know that you're doing it well? How would you evaluate if you're being successful in what you are doing? Give me a simple answer that will help me, that will help our audience out there, that will help the church globally. What does it mean to be successful? Because I think if we feel that we're doing what's right, then this helps in the area that can revive our hope, that can make us a hopeful people. And so how can we be hopeful people? How do we know that we are doing what is right and that we are succeeding in our calling and our mission? Who would like to? And this is your closing reflection for tonight.
So you had asked, Martin, before this question also about what can we do to engage, what's practically, and I'm in Geneva, but one of the things that I've been able to do is personally, and as our church here, is to support the ministries in Lebanon at a time when half of the population and more has become poor. So the priority is to help the Lebanese, the poor among us, or our poor neighbor, and we're helping churches in Lebanon, and I'm also playing a role in this and communicating with a few churches in Lebanon to help on poverty issues. So that's one thing that I felt called to do. But as with regards to your question of successful, I reflect a lot on this question because I work in Geneva on human rights advocacy at the Human Rights Council on behalf of the churches, and how do you measure success? Well, sometimes we have to think through about are we called to be fruitful, or actually are we called to be faithful? And every few months I go back and do the same cycle of thinking, and I discover that am I being faithful in my life and to God's calling? Not am I being successful, am I being faithful? And then a few days ago, I read an article saying the paradox of the Christian labor. The master desires 1 coin to become 10, but the event is in his hands. Strive as if the world is worth dying for, though it's not your death to die. Engage the demonic power systems that comprise the principalities of this world, yet do so knowing that there is nothing you can finally do to them, but point them to the one who made them a laughing stock on the cross. And we are called to be faithful. If we are faithful, God will make fruit of our labor. And that's what I would like to answer your question.
Thank you, Wissam. So you would describe success as faithfulness. Nadia?
Yeah, I know that we're running a bit short on time, so I'll be quick. I just wanted to push back on the idea that the church maybe is not engaged enough. I think that the crises of the last few years have caused many more people to get involved, and with some of the most marginalized communities, and relationships change each of us individually, and I think they're beginning to change the church. I've seen some amazing transformations in the last few years, so just to encourage us all. In terms of your final question, Martin, I think I'm fortunate to be in a line of work where I can see very quickly on a day-to-day basis small yet significant changes, and for me that's an encouragement and a sign that we should continue, even though there are very, very hard days and very hard things that we see. And one day we hope to have a system that supports people, not just piecemeal work like this, but we'll continue until that day comes.
Thank you, Nadia. So perhaps seeing change in individual people and families' lives is how you see your work being successful. And Eugene?
We're celebrating 2025, the 500th or the quincentennial of the Anabaptist Mennonite Church. And one of our slogans is, Christ said to us, I didn't come to give you peace, but to bring you the sword. And the sword does not mean the sword in our hand, like a lot of Christians see it in Lebanon. The sword is oppression, persecution. How do we know we're doing the right thing? When we're being persecuted. And we will be persecuted by the Christian Sultan for doing the right thing. So once we Christians are persecuted by the Christian Sultan, you'll know we're doing the right thing.
Thank you, Eugene. And I suppose persecution is different from being opposed, because we have Christian sultas also who feel very self-righteous when they are being opposed, because then that's proof that they are being persecuted and therefore doing the right thing. We see that illness within the church as well sometimes. Thank you so much to our guests, our three guests, for all the preparations you did for this and for really enriching this conversation. And thank you to our audience that has remained steadfast. We still have 68 people with us, which is remarkable. So thank you so much, every one of you out there around the world, for joining this conversation. I leave you with these three concepts about success, because I think success, and I don't like this word, I want to replace it with the biblical word hope. And so you will grow in hope if you are faithful, if you focus on small life transformation, and if you start seeing that you are persecuted, that you are disliked by the rulers of this world, and there's a chance that you are actually doing what's right from the perspective of the kingdom of God. And I believe this will give you hope in the midst of persecution and suffering. So I want to end on those thoughts. Everyone, as you leave this conversation, you are going to have a survey that pops up in front of you. We would urge you as a team to fill out a very quick survey. This will give us some feedback for this session that can help us as we continue to organize these sorts of conversations in the future. And I would like also to remind you that we will have one more session in this conversation series. That one is going to be in December, and it's going to be a book launch, and it's a book that was published or is going to be published, inshallah, next month, that brought together the contributions of speakers and theologians and in 2018 and 2019 for our annual conversations. And Jonathan Andrews and myself have co-edited this volume, and I actually think it's brilliant. Not because I edited it, because an editor has nothing to do with content. I think I really enjoyed doing this work because there's so much valuable material in that book. So please join us in December. You will receive an announcement as we come closer to the date for the time of it. And I hope you will be able to join us. And the reason why we're skipping November for the conversations is because we are celebrating our 60th anniversary as a seminary, as ABTS, the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary. And we will have a special event that will also be of a very theological nature. Please keep your antennas out, stay posted on what ABTS is doing. Join us in November for our 60th anniversary, and join us again in December for a book launch as our final conversation in this Middle East Conversation 2020 series. And for now, I wish you good night for those in my side of the world and further east, and have a great continuation of the day for those of you who have joined us from North America and generally from more west of us. Goodbye.